Recently, I was going through my craft supplies when I came across these styrofoam eggs, and I figured, why not try painting a few of them for some festive fun? For the first design idea that came to mind, I started out by cutting off the more narrow bottom of the egg. This was going to give it a more accurate shape for my design idea while also allowing it to sit upright without having to worry about it falling over. I also inserted a short piece of wire into the bottom of the egg just so that it was easier for me to hold on to it while I was painting it. Now because the egg is styrofoam, I decided to add a couple of coats of a primer base. For this, I just used some wood glue. It helped fill in the different little holes that the styrofoam creates while also allowing paint to sit much easier on the surface. Once the priming layers dried, I decided to draw a rough oval shape on the side of the egg, just to give myself a rough idea of where I didn't want to add black paint to. And of course that means the next step that I took was to actually paint the remaining area in a black acrylic paint. So I painted the entire surface of the egg with black acrylic paint with the exception of that oval area. And once the black paint had dried, I decided to actually paint that oval area in white. And I'm sure by now you can probably guess that this is turning into a no-face egg design. Once the paint had dried, I decided to roughly make some markings of where I wanted the facial features to go. Because this egg sort of messed with the usual proportions of no face, I decided to do a more cutesy design for the face. Because I felt that keeping it too close to the original design might look a bit strange since this was a much more kind of squished down version of this character. And I decided since this was a more simplistic design to actually try using my Posca pens. So I started by working on the eyes and mouth with the black color. And then I continued on with drawing on the face triangles with the purple. Yeah, I just figured, I never get to use my Poscas as much as I would like, and I figured, the design things, it's pretty simplistic, but the areas are pretty small, so it would be a great candidate for using these pens. So as you saw, I added some blushies and then finished it off with a couple of white dots for eye highlights. And here's the finished no-face egg. Now I wanted at least one of these egg designs to utilize the entire egg without any cutting modifications. And so I was trying to think of a notable creature or character that could be translated into a very egg shape, and the first thing that came to mind was a porg. So I started off by doing the exact same prep work that I did for the first egg, so the whole wood glue, priming, and sanding situation, and then I wanted to do a rough mock-up of where I wanted the facial features to go and kind of the front chest feather pattern to be. Because the Posca pens worked so well on the no-face egg, I decided to use them for the porg as well, essentially more as place markers for the facial features. Now, a porg is a very feathery creature, so I tried to come up with a simple but effective paint technique to achieve that feathery look. The majority of the body feathers around the belly area and the rest of the body are basically a gray paint, a brownish tan sort of paint, and white. And what I did was I just took with a medium-sized brush, like nothing too large, just did fairly thick textured strokes with it, just layering the different colors of paint to try and achieve that feathery look. And this is also where my pencil markings came in handy because I did decide to, for right now, avoid the center belly area where it is pretty much white and around the eye and mouth area, which is also white. So I continued this technique for the entirety of the body. Anywhere that I felt needed a bit more texture, I just added a few more layers of the various colors and then used the other colors of wet paint to blend it in a little more. Then it was back to working on the front of the porg. Like I mentioned, the feathers in the front area and around the facial features are basically white, but looking at reference pictures, they do still have a decent amount of definition, so I also decided to add in a little bit of the gray and just blend it in a bit with the white to give it a more three-dimensional feathery look. And once the white paint had dried, I decided to go back in around the eyes with an orangey-ish yellow ochre type color. Now there are actually different colored porgs that have different combinations and variations on their feather colors and patterns, but I decided that I wanted mine to have this orange feather texture around the eyes. And using the same feathery stroke technique, I also added in a bit of white just to give it, again, a bit more definition and also blend the orange into the white feathers in the face. I also went back over the facial features with some black paint, this time using a brush just to give myself more precision and control. I also decided to paint on some black lines onto either side of the body to symbolize the wings. In the final step for this porg paint job, I decided to go back around the eyes with some white paint and also add highlights to the eyes. And here is what the finished porg paint job looks like. Now, because I kept this the traditional egg shape, I figured the perfect solution of how to keep it standing upright would be to actually add some feet to it. So just using some scrap watercolor paper, I drew up a rough foot design, painted it using the appropriate goldeny brown color, also decided to add some claw details, and then just hot glued it onto the bottom to help this porg stand on its own. And here is what the finished porg egg looks like. For the final egg design, I really wanted to go all out. And this was actually my first idea that came to mind when I thought about doing this video, decorating these eggs, because this is one of the more recent popular egg-shaped things in the media, and that is, of course, Baby Yoda in his cradle. So I started off by making markings on the egg so that I knew exactly where I wanted to cut the little slice out to actually create the cradle shape. And then, you guessed it, the apparent usual priming routine of the wood glue. Now, because I cut out such a large chunk, I also decided to add a bit of wood filler just to fill in some of the gaps that the foam pulling apart created in the inside area of the cradle. For the paint job, I started out by painting the entirety of the outside of the cradle in a creamy gray color. Then the inner top area, this yellow ochre color, and then the bottom area I decided to do in a dark brown. Now I wanted this cradle to be decently detailed, so I decided to create and cut out the side joint circular areas of the cradle, just using again some scraps of watercolor paper just to give it a more three-dimensional look. Those also got painted in the grayish cream color. And then it was time to work on one of the most important parts of this egg design, the green bean. I actually traced the cutout portion of the egg to try and get the sizing right for him. I also created a tab so that it could be easily glued into the inside of the cradle. For his paint job, I started off by outlining his facial features and just sort of outlining the entirety of him using a super fine liner. This was again sort of like I did with the porg, more of an underpainting idea just to make those lines a little more visible than the pencil would have been, but also not worrying about painting over them. I did start off with his green skin color. I also roughly painted the back of his head just because you can kind of see it, and then I moved on to the pink of the ears and also added some cute little blushies. Then of course some tan color for his little jacket, and then I went over his facial features with a super fine paintbrush and some black paint. Next I decided to glue on the side circular pieces as well as Baby Yoda into the cradle, just so that everything was already glued on before I finished up the paint job on the cradle itself. And of course I let that glue dry before moving on to doing anything else. To finish off the cradle design itself, I started by marking the different lines using a pencil. There's actually quite a lot of detail on the cradle, and it's segmented into a lot of different areas. I started with the rim line that goes around the entirety of the cradle, then moved on to the actual segmented parts of the upper carriage. There's also lines of segmentation underneath, and then there are indentations on the upper bassinet section of it as well. There are also reddish-orange side panels on either side, and other little details that I gradually added to the sketch later. The majority of the remainder of the paint job I did in a grayish tan color, basically just to add some textured scuffing to the entirety of the cradle and also try and shade in those panels because on the cradle itself they are either raised areas or indented areas, so giving it those shadows around the lines definitely helped make this a lot more realistic. Yeah, I wasn't really being too perfect with this. It is a decently dirty and scuffed up cradle, so essentially the messier the paint job, the better it's going to look. I then moved on to redrawing the details on the little side circular pieces. I guess you could call them hinges, I don't know, whatever these pieces are. And while I had my pencil out and I was drawing ridiculously small detail, I also went back and added the panel to the front of the cradle. Next, I decided to add the reddish details, so the side half moons on those hinges, as well as the panels on the side, and also there is a red little mark on the back side of either side of the cradle as well, that I didn't bother drawing in. And the final step for this cradle paint job was to add the more pronounced gray patches that are essentially scuffing on the different areas of the cradle. I also decided to go back in a few areas and just darken things up to make the shading even more pronounced. And here's what the finished Baby Yoda in his cradle egg looks like. I did also decide to add a small dollop of hot glue on to the bottom of the cradle itself, just to essentially act as a little stand for it. Yeah, those are my 3 finished egg designs. I hope you enjoyed seeing me customize these eggs. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.